In the spring of 2023, a sobering reality confronted American naval planners in the Pentagon. For the first time in over 80 years, the United States Navy was no longer the largest in the world by hull count. China's People's Liberation Army Navy had surpassed it, boasting over 370 ships compared to America's 296. This wasn't merely a statistical anomaly. It represented the culmination of 2 decades of relentless Chinese shipbuilding, a maritime expansion that observers had begun calling the greatest naval buildup since the Second World War. Chinese shipyards were launching destroyers, frigates, and corvettes at a pace that seemed impossible to Western analysts. Some called it the dumplings in broth approach, after the Chinese expression describing how quickly one can produce these filled delicacies when working at scale. One hull after another, rolling off production lines in Shanghai, Dalian, and Guangzhou with industrial efficiency that harked back to America's own wartime manufacturing miracles. But raw numbers, as we will explore in exhaustive detail, tell only a fraction of the story. Behind closed doors in Arlington and Norfolk, a different conversation was taking place. A conversation about the fundamental nature of naval warfare itself, and whether the assumptions that had governed maritime strategy for the past century were about to become dangerously obsolete. To understand the magnitude of China's naval expansion, we must first appreciate the historical context. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the People's Liberation Army Navy was essentially a coastal defense force. Its vessels were antiquated Soviet designs or crude domestic copies barely capable of operating beyond sight of the Chinese coastline. Fast forward 30 years and the transformation is staggering. China now operates 2 aircraft carriers with a 3rd under construction. It has launched Type 055 cruisers that many analysts consider among the most capable surface combatants in the world. Its shipyards produce guided missile destroyers at a rate of multiple vessels per year. The Jiangnan shipyard alone can build surface combatants faster than all American shipyards combined. This industrial capacity is not accidental. It reflects decades of strategic planning and enormous state investment. China identified maritime power as essential to its geopolitical ambitions, its territorial claims in the South China Sea, its Belt and Road Initiative, and its aspiration to supplant American influence in the Western Pacific. The numbers became impossible to ignore. By 2020, China's Navy had grown to include approximately 130 major surface combatants compared to the United States Navy's 90. When you factor in corvettes, patrol craft, and auxiliary vessels, the gap becomes even more pronounced. But quantity metrics reveal something else that concerned American strategists. China was building a navy optimized for a very specific kind of fight. A fight in the waters around Taiwan in the East and South China Seas within what military theorists call the first and second island chains. Every vessel, every weapon system, every sensor array was designed with one overarching purpose: to deny the United States Navy access to these waters in the event of a conflict. This is the essence of anti-access area denial, known by its acronym A2AD. China has constructed an integrated system of coastal missile batteries, long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, like the YJ-18 and YJ-12 ballistic missiles specifically designed to target aircraft carriers such as the DF-21D and DF-26, advanced diesel, electric, and nuclear submarines, sophisticated radar and satellite networks, and hundreds of 4th and 5th generation fighter aircraft. This layered defensive architecture creates what strategists call a denial envelope, a zone of lethal coverage extending up to 1,000 miles from the Chinese coast, where American surface ships would face existential threats from multiple vectors simultaneously. The implications were clear and troubling. In a conflict over Taiwan, American carrier strike groups would need to operate within this envelope to project power effectively. But doing so would expose $11 billion carriers and their accompanying escorts to salvos of anti-ship missiles launched from platforms that might cost a tiny fraction of their targets. The mathematics of this exchange ratio were unfavorable at best, catastrophic at worst. A single DF-21D missile might cost $2 million. A Nimitz-class carrier cost over $8 billion and carries 5,000 sailors. Even if 9 out of 10 missiles were intercepted, the 10th could potentially achieve a mission kill or worse. This is the tyranny of geography and mass that China had engineered, By building large numbers of relatively affordable platforms and weapons, by operating close to their own shores with the advantages of land-based support, China had created a scenario where American naval superiority might not translate into operational success. Some analysts began arguing that the era of American naval dominance was ending, that the Pacific was becoming a Chinese lake, that the United States would have to accept Beijing's regional hegemony as an accomplished fact. But these assessments, dramatic as they seemed, were based on a fundamental assumption. They assumed that the next naval conflict would look essentially like the last one, that it would be fought by manned warships firing missiles at other manned warships, that victory would go to the side with more hulls, more missiles, and more favorable geography. What these analyses failed to anticipate was that the United States Navy was not trying to win the last war. It was trying to invent an entirely new kind of warfare. The origins of what would eventually be called the Golden Fleet Initiative can be traced back to the mid-2010s when the Navy's strategic planners began seriously grappling with the A2AD problem. The initial response was a concept called distributed lethality, introduced formally in 2015. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of concentrating naval firepower in a small number of high-value platforms like carrier strike groups, the Navy would distribute its offensive capability across a much larger number of platforms operating dispersed throughout a battle space. Every surface ship would become a hunter capable of projecting offensive power, not just defending itself. Cruisers and destroyers that had primarily served as escorts would be equipped with long-range offensive missiles. Smaller vessels like littoral combat ships would receive over-the-horizon anti-ship missiles. Even support ships would be armed. The logic was straightforward. If you spread your offensive capability across dozens of platforms operating hundreds of miles apart, you force your adversary to disperse their sensors, their targeting systems, and their weapons across an enormous volume of ocean. You create targeting complexity. You make it exponentially harder for them to find and kill your forces. But distributed lethality was just the beginning, just the first conceptual step toward a much more radical transformation. Because if distributing lethality across manned ships made sense, then distributing it across unmanned ships made even more sense. An unmanned vessel could take risks that would be unconscionable with a crewed platform. It could operate in the most dangerous zones of a battle space without risking human lives. It could be smaller, cheaper, and more expendable. And if you could build unmanned vessels at a fraction of the cost of traditional warships, you could deploy them in numbers that would fundamentally change the mathematics of naval combat. This realization led to the Ghost Fleet Overlord program, launched in 2017 as a partnership between the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the Office of Naval Research. The goal was ambitious: develop large, unmanned surface vessels capable of autonomous or remote operation across thousands of miles of ocean. These wouldn't be small remote-controlled boats. They would be substantial ships over 200 feet in length, capable of carrying significant payloads of sensors and weapons, operating for months at a time with minimal human intervention. The program converted two commercial fast supply vessels, the Nomad and the Ranger, into testbeds for the technologies needed to make this vision real. Machine learning algorithms for navigation and collision avoidance, autonomous systems for machinery, monitoring, and maintenance, secure communication networks for command and control, integration software to allow these unmanned vessels to operate seamlessly alongside manned ships. By 2020, the Ghost Fleet vessels had completed thousands of miles of autonomous operations, including a journey from the Gulf of Mexico to California through the Panama Canal. They had demonstrated the ability to navigate congested sea lanes, respond to dynamic conditions, and operate in coordination with manned vessels. The technological feasibility was proven. Now it was time to operationalize the concept. The Navy began developing two classes of unmanned surface vessels. The medium unmanned surface vehicle, roughly 45 to 190 feet in length, designed for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and mine countermeasures. And the large unmanned surface vehicle, over 200 feet, designed specifically to serve as missile magazines. These large USVs would each carry dozens of vertical launch cells, the same systems used on Arleigh Burke destroyers to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, standard air defense missiles, and anti-ship missiles. But unlike a destroyer, a large USV would cost perhaps $300 million instead of $2 billion. It wouldn't need sleeping quarters, galleys, or life support systems. It wouldn't need the armor and defensive systems required to protect a crew. It would be, in essence, a floating missile battery that could be positioned throughout a battle space as needed. The strategic implications were profound. Imagine a scenario where instead of sending 3 or 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers into contested waters, you send 15 large USVs, each carrying 32 vertical launch cells. You've just deployed 480 missiles on platforms that together cost less than a single destroyer and risk 0 American lives. These USVs could be positioned hundreds of miles apart, creating a distributed network of offensive firepower across thousands of square miles of ocean. Some could sit quietly in emissions control, appearing to Chinese sensors as little more than commercial traffic. Others could actively broadcast false signatures, complicating the enemy's targeting picture. Still others could move aggressively, probing defenses, forcing responses, gathering intelligence on enemy sensors and weapon systems, and because they're unmanned, you can afford to lose some without suffering the kind of catastrophic political and morale consequences that come with the deaths of sailors. But unmanned vessels were only one component of the emerging strategy. The real revolution would come from how these platforms were networked together, how they shared information, and how decisions would be made across this distributed force. This brings us to Project Overmatch, perhaps the most ambitious and least understood element of the Navy's transformation. Project Overmatch is the naval component of the Pentagon's Joint All-Domain Command and Control Initiative, itself a response to the realization that modern warfare requires instantaneous information sharing across all military branches and domains. The concept is both simple and extraordinarily complex. In traditional naval operations, individual ships or strike groups operate with significant autonomy. A destroyer captain makes decisions based on the information available to their own sensors, and perhaps some shared intelligence from other nearby vessels. Coordination happens through voice communications and relatively slow data links. This worked fine when engagements unfolded over hours or days. But modern missile warfare happens at a different tempo. Hypersonic weapons can traverse hundreds of miles in minutes. Cyber attacks occur at electronic speed. The sensor picture changes moment by moment. Human commanders, no matter how well trained, simply cannot process information and make decisions fast enough to optimize the employment of distributed forces across a vast battle space. Project Overmatch aims to create a network where every sensor feeds into a common operational picture that's accessible to every shooter in near real time. An F-35 fighter operating 500 miles away detects a Chinese destroyer with its advanced radar. That information is instantly available to a submarine operating beneath the surface, a large USV 300 miles in another direction, and a destroyer over the horizon. Artificial intelligence analyzes the threat, calculates optimal firing solutions from available platforms, considers factors like remaining ammunition, platform vulnerability, rules of engagement, and the overall tactical situation. It then provides recommendations to human commanders who can authorize engagement with a simple confirmation. The entire process, from detection to decision to weapon launch, takes seconds instead of minutes or hours. This is decision superiority. The ability to understand the battle space faster, decide faster, and act faster than your adversary. It's the informational equivalent of the advantage that steam-powered gave over sail, or that radar gave in World War II. The artificial intelligence systems being developed for this purpose are not science fiction. They're based on proven technologies in machine learning, sensor fusion, and decision support that have been under development for over a decade. The challenge isn't teaching a computer to process radar returns or calculate missile trajectories. It's integrating thousands of sensors, databases, and weapon systems into a coherent network that can function across vast distances with resilient communications, even in the face of cyber attacks and electronic warfare. It's ensuring that human operators retain meaningful control over the use of force while enabling machine-speed decision-making. It's creating systems that can adapt to unexpected situations, that can function when communications are degraded, that can operate in a contested electromagnetic spectrum where jamming and spoofing are constant threats. The Navy has been conducting exercises to validate these concepts. In the Unmanned Integrated Battle Problem events held in 2021 and 2023, unmanned underwater vehicles and unmanned underwater vehicles and unmanned aerial systems operated in coordination with manned ships and aircraft. They successfully conducted surveillance missions, identified simulated threats, and prosecuted targets using live weapons. Commanders described the events as proof that the technology had matured beyond experimental status, that unmanned systems could serve as credible combat multipliers, not just intelligence platforms, that the networked approach to warfare could work in practice, not just in theory. Alongside the platform revolution, weapons technology has evolved to match the new strategy. The Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, represents a quantum leap in capability over previous generation anti-ship weapons. Developed by Lockheed Martin and deployed operationally beginning in 2019, LRASM is designed specifically to penetrate sophisticated air defense networks like those China has deployed. It uses a combination of semi-autonomous guidance, low observable characteristics, and advanced algorithms to evade detection and countermeasures. Unlike older anti-ship missiles that require continuous external guidance or that broadcast radar signals that can be detected and jammed, LRASM can operate in radio silence. It has its own sensors to detect and classify targets. It can receive updated targeting information from other platforms through data links, or it can hunt autonomously if communications are denied. It can discriminate between military and civilian vessels, prioritize targets based on threat level, and coordinate attacks with other missiles to overwhelm defenses. The implications for penetrating Chinese A2AD systems are significant, because LRAM can be launched from beyond the range of most Chinese air defenses. American platforms can fire from relatively safe distances. Because it doesn't require continuous guidance, the launching platform can immediately retreat or go silent, making it harder to target. Because multiple missiles can coordinate their attack, arriving from different vectors at the same time, they can saturate defensive systems that might successfully intercept one or two weapons, but fail against a simultaneous salvo. And because LRASM can be launched from ships, submarines, and aircraft, it creates uncertainty for Chinese defenders about where threats might emerge. The Navy is also developing hypersonic weapons missiles that travel at over 5 times the speed of sound, compressing decision times to almost nothing. The conventional prompt strike system being developed for submarines and surface ships will give American forces the ability to hold Chinese ships, bases, and critical infrastructure at risk from ranges exceeding 1,700 miles, far beyond the reach of most Chinese anti-ship systems. These weapons are extraordinarily difficult to intercept. Their speed and maneuverability during terminal approach makes them nearly impossible to engage with current defensive systems. A hypersonic anti-ship missile launched from a submarine could strike a Chinese carrier group with almost no warning, potentially before defensive systems even recognize the threat. Submarines remain perhaps the most potent element of American naval power, and the one where the United States retains unambiguous superiority. The Virginia-class attack submarines and Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines represent the cutting edge of undersea warfare technology. They are quieter than any submarines China operates. They carry more weapons. They have better sensors, and they operate with crews that have decades more experience in subsurface warfare than their Chinese counterparts. In any conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, American submarines would enjoy what strategists call sea denial capability, the ability to prevent enemy forces from operating freely in a given area. Chinese surface ships, including their prized aircraft carriers, would face a constant, invisible threat. Every time a Chinese destroyer left port, it would need to assume that an American submarine might be tracking it, might have already positioned itself for an attack, might be waiting for the order to fire. This threat would force Chinese forces into defensive postures, would limit their freedom of maneuver, would consume resources in anti-submarine warfare that might otherwise be used offensively. The United States operates 68 submarines compared to China's approximately 60, but the quality gap is substantial. Chinese submarines, despite improvements, remain significantly noisier than American boats, making them easier to detect and track. Chinese anti-submarine warfare capabilities lag years behind American systems, and Chinese submariners lack the decades of operational experience that American crews possess. This imbalance matters enormously in undersea warfare, where small advantages in acoustic stealth or sensor performance can mean the difference between hunter and hunted. So how would this new paradigm of naval warfare actually function in a conflict scenario? Let's walk through a notional but realistic engagement. The scenario is a Chinese attempt to enforce a blockade of Taiwan. Beijing has declared an exclusion zone around the island, announcing that any vessel attempting to interdiction Iowa's waters will be subject to interdiction. The United States, committed to Taiwan's defense and to preserving freedom of navigation, determines it must break this blockade. In a traditional naval confrontation, the American response would involve sending carrier strike groups toward Taiwan escorted by destroyers and submarines. These high-value units would need to fight their way through multiple layers of Chinese defenses: shore-based anti-ship missiles, bomber aircraft launching cruise missiles, surface action groups of destroyers and frigates, diesel submarines lurking in shallow waters. The Chinese strategy would be to launch massive saturation attacks, firing hundreds of missiles at American carriers and their escorts, hoping that sheer volume would overwhelm defensive systems. But the Golden Fleet approach looks entirely different. Weeks before the crisis, the Navy has quietly deployed dozens of large USVs throughout the western Pacific. Some are positioned in the Philippine Sea, others near the Ryukyu Islands. Still others are dispersed across the vast expanse between Japan and Guam. They sit at the far edge of satellite communication range, receiving compressed data bursts periodically but otherwise operating autonomously. To Chinese surveillance, they appear to be commercial vessels or small military craft of no particular importance. When the crisis begins, American carrier strike groups remain far to the east, over 1,200 miles from Taiwan, well outside the range of Chinese land-based missiles. But those seemingly unimportant USVs suddenly become active. Using their vertical launch cells, they begin firing LRASM missiles at Chinese destroyers attempting to enforce the blockade. Because the USVs are dispersed across such a wide area, the Chinese cannot effectively respond. They would need to simultaneously defend against attacks from multiple vectors, from platforms they may not have even detected yet. Meanwhile, Virginia-class submarines that have been operating silently in Chinese coastal waters move into firing positions. They launch Tomahawk missiles at Chinese air defense radars and command centers, degrading China's ability to coordinate their own forces. They fire torpedoes at Chinese destroyers and amphibious assault ships. Because the submarines are nearly impossible to detect, the Chinese have no effective response. Above the surface, American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, operating from bases in Japan and the Philippines, use their advanced sensors to track Chinese surface forces. This tracking data is fed into the Overmatch network, giving unmanned surface vessels and submarines precise targeting information. B-21 bomber aircraft, using their stealth capabilities to penetrate Chinese air defenses, launch their own anti-ship missiles from standoff ranges. F-35 fighters operating from aircraft carriers and forward bases contribute to the sensor picture while also conducting their own strikes. The Chinese find themselves in a nightmare scenario. They're being attacked from every direction by weapons launched from platforms they cannot find or cannot effectively target. Their own massive inventory of ships becomes a liability as each vessel represents a potential target whose destruction consumes resources without generating equivalent value. Their shore-based missiles, so effective in theory, cannot reach the American carriers that remain safely over the horizon. When they do launch missiles at detected American ships, many of those targets turn out to be USVs, expendable platforms whose loss causes minimal damage to American capabilities. The Chinese attempt to use their own submarines, but American anti-submarine warfare aircraft and friendly submarines have been tracking many of these boats since they left port. Some are sunk, others are forced to remain at safe depth, unable to effectively engage. China's numerical superiority in hulls proves irrelevant because most of those hulls never engage. They're either held back to defend the Chinese coast, sunk before they can close to effective range, or forced into defensive postures by the threat of submarine attack. After 72 hours of intense combat, the Chinese blockade is in shambles. Dozens of destroyers and frigates have been sunk or damaged. Air defense networks along the coast have been suppressed. Amphibious assault ships that might have been used to invade Taiwan have been destroyed or forced back to port. And the American carriers, the crown jewels of the fleet, never entered the most dangerous zones. They remained in relative safety, serving as command hubs and aviation platforms, while unmanned systems and submarines did the most dangerous work. This is not science fiction. Every technology described here either exists operationally today or is in advanced testing. The USVs exist. LRASM is deployed. Project Overmatch is being field tested. The submarines are conducting patrols. The infrastructure for this kind of distributed, networked warfare is being built right now. The genius of this approach is that it turns China's own strategy against them. To come to them, would have to operate within range of Chinese missiles and aircraft. The Golden Fleet concept flips this calculus. By pushing offensive capability forward onto inexpensive, unmanned platforms, the United States can hold Chinese forces at risk without exposing high-value units. By networking everything together, American forces can achieve information superiority even when operating dispersed across vast areas. By integrating manned and unmanned systems, the Navy multiplies its effective combat power without proportionally increasing costs or risks. The hull count metric that seemed to favor China so dramatically becomes almost meaningless. What matters isn't how many ships you have, but how effectively you can employ the capabilities those ships represent across a contested battle space. Critics of the Golden Fleet approach raise legitimate concerns. Unmanned systems, they argue, remain vulnerable to cyber attacks and electronic warfare. Autonomous vessels might malfunction or be spoofed into attacking the wrong targets. The artificial intelligence systems coordinating these forces might make errors with catastrophic consequences. Communications networks might be disrupted, leaving unmanned vessels isolated and ineffective. These are real challenges, and the Navy takes them seriously. Cybersecurity has become a top priority, with enormous investments in resilient networks and encrypted communications. Autonomous systems include multiple safeguards and human oversight requirements, especially regarding the use of lethal force. Platforms are designed to operate in communications-degraded environments with pre-programmed instructions and onboard decision-making capability. Another criticism focuses on the industrial base. If the strategy requires building dozens or hundreds of unmanned vessels, can American shipyards handle that demand? Chinese shipbuilding capacity dwarfs America's. If the conflict becomes one of attrition, of replacing losses and building new platforms, doesn't China still have the advantage? The counterargument is that unmanned vessels are fundamentally easier to build than traditional warships. They're smaller. They don't require the complex life support and habitability systems that make crude ships so expensive and time-consuming to construct. They can leverage commercial shipyard capacity, not just military yards. And because they're designed for shorter service lives, potentially just 5 to 10 years instead of 30 or 40, the design can be simplified. The Navy has already contracted with commercial shipbuilders for prototype USVs, demonstrating that non-traditional yards can build these vessels. In a high-intensity conflict, American industry could likely scale up production significantly, especially given that each unmanned vessel costs a fraction of what a traditional warship costs. There's also the question of whether this approach truly represents a revolution or merely an evolution. After has always been a force multiplier. Radar gave Allied forces decisive advantages in World War II, despite sometimes facing numerically superior Axis fleets. Submarines have been asymmetric weapons since their invention. Is the Golden Fleet really that different? The answer is yes, because of degree and integration. Previous technological advantages were incremental, giving one side better sensors or longer-range weapons. The Golden Fleet concept represents a systemic advantage, where multiple technologies combine synergistically to create capabilities that are orders of magnitude more effective than their components. An unmanned surface vessel by itself is interesting but limited. That same USV networked into an integrated battle force, coordinating with satellites, submarines, aircraft, and AI decision support systems, becomes something entirely different. It's the difference between having a calculator and having the internet. Both are technologies, but one fundamentally transforms what's possible. We must also consider the human dimension of this transformation. Naval warfare has always been intensely human. The courage of sailors under fire, the judgment of commanders making split-second decisions, the cohesion of crews working together under extreme stress. Does a paradigm that relies heavily on unmanned systems and artificial intelligence somehow diminish this human element? The Navy's answer is an emphatic no. Humans remain at the center of this system, making the critical decisions about when and where force is employed, interpreting the strategic picture, adapting to unexpected situations that AI cannot handle. What changes is that humans are freed from some of the more routine, dangerous, or time-consuming tasks. They're not standing watch on a vulnerable destroyer in contested waters. They're not trying to manually correlate sensor data from dozens of platforms. They're doing what humans do best, exercising judgment, creativity, and moral reasoning in complex, ambiguous situations. The technology doesn't replace human decision-making. It amplifies it. China is not standing still in the face of these developments. They're developing their own unmanned systems, their own AI capabilities, their own networked warfare concepts. The question is not whether China can eventually develop equivalent technologies, but whether they can do so fast enough and effectively enough to offset American advantages. History suggests this is harder than it appears. China has proven very capable at copying and adapting existing technologies. But innovation at the cutting edge is different. It requires not just technical skill, but also operational experience, institutional culture that tolerates risk and experimentation, and integration across multiple complex systems. The United States has been pioneering unmanned warfare for 2 decades, from Predator drones in Afghanistan to autonomous systems in Iraq to naval prototypes in the Pacific. That accumulated experience, encoded in doctrine, training, and institutional knowledge, represents an advantage that cannot easily be copied. There's also the question of China's strategic culture and command structure. The People's Liberation Army remains a highly centralized organization where initiative sometimes matters more than competence. This works reasonably well for executing predetermined plans, but can be a significant liability in the chaos of actual combat, where adaptation and initiative become essential. The distributed, networked approach that the Golden Fleet embodies requires trust in junior officers, requires giving them the authority to make decisions rapidly without waiting for approval from higher echelons. It requires a culture of experimentation where failure is accepted as part of learning. These are not strengths of the PLA system. As we look toward the future, several trajectories seem clear. First, unmanned systems will become an increasingly dominant element of naval forces, not just for the United States, but for all advanced militaries. The advantages are too compelling to ignore. Second, artificial intelligence and autonomous systems will play growing roles in command and control, not because militaries want to take humans out of the loop, but because the complexity and speed of modern warfare demand it. Third, the definition of naval power will continue to shift away from simple hull counts toward measures of network capability, sensor coverage, and decision speed. A navy of 150 highly advanced, networked unmanned and manned vessels may be far more powerful than a navy of 400 traditional ships operating independently. None of this means that aircraft carriers or traditional surface combatants will disappear. They retain unique capabilities that unmanned systems cannot replicate. Carriers project air power and provide command hubs. Destroyers and cruisers offer defensive capabilities and sustainability. But these traditional platforms will increasingly operate as nodes in a larger network, as elements of a system rather than as independent actors. The carrier will be the queen on a chessboard that includes many more pieces than before, pieces that extend its reach, multiply its effectiveness, and reduce its vulnerability. The strategic competition between the United States and China will not be determined by economics, diplomacy, alliances, and resolve all matter enormously. But naval power remains fundamental in the Indo-Pacific, where geography makes maritime forces essential to projecting influence and protecting interests. If China believes it has achieved decisive naval superiority through sheer numbers, it may be tempted to act on that belief, to attempt reunification with Taiwan by force, to enforce expansive territorial claims, to coerce neighbors into accepting Chinese hegemony. If the United States can demonstrate convincingly that Chinese numerical superiority does not translate into operational superiority, that attempting to use force would result in catastrophic losses, then deterrence is strengthened. War becomes less likely, not more. This brings us back to where we began. China's navy is the largest in the world by hull count. This is an indisputable fact. But the question we must ask is whether that fact remains strategically meaningful in an era where naval warfare is being fundamentally redefined. When a single unmanned vessel costing a few $100 million can carry as many missiles as a destroyer costing $2 billion and risking hundreds of lives. When artificial intelligence can coordinate attacks by dozens of platforms simultaneously, creating targeting complexity that overwhelms defenses. When submarines can operate with near impunity against surface forces. When networks allow sensors on one platform to cue weapons on another platform hundreds of miles away. When all of these capabilities combine into an integrated system. Does hull count still determine naval supremacy? The American bet embodied in the Golden Fleet Initiative and its associated technologies is that the answer is no. That we are living through a transition as profound as the shift from sail to steam, from dreadnoughts to carriers, from analog to digital, that the Navy that masters distributed, networked unmanned warfare will dominate the oceans regardless of how many traditional ships their adversary possesses. History will judge whether this bet was correct, whether the technologies prove as effective in actual combat as they appear in exercises and analysis, whether American shipyards can build these systems fast enough, whether the operational concepts work as designed, whether human crews and commanders can adapt to this new paradigm. But one thing is already clear. The assumption that China had achieved lasting naval superiority through sheer production volume was premature. The race is not over. In many ways, it's only beginning. And the finish line is not measured in hulls, but in something far more complex, far more challenging, and ultimately far more important. The ability to understand, decide, and act faster than your adversary across the vast expanses of the world's oceans. That is what will define naval power in the 21st century. That is the true measure of supremacy. And on that measure, the United States Navy remains not just competitive, but potentially dominant. The Golden Fleet is not a single program or platform. It's a vision of warfare where information speed, autonomy, and network effects matter more than tonnage, where quality, training, and innovation trump quantity, where American technological and operational advantages are leveraged asymmetrically against an adversary's weaknesses. China built the world's largest navy. The United States is building something different, something that may render size irrelevant. And in that difference lies the future of naval warfare itself.